My name's Penny Hicks. I'm in Manchester Counterfire, and I'm chairing this session now. It'll last for an hour, and then we'll have a break for lunch. We've got two speakers who'll speak for around about 12 minutes each. So there'll be time for questions and comments on what they've said. Such a pertinent topic for today. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what our speakers have to say. And please do feel free to use the raise hand function so that we can all enjoy your comments and points of discussion. So our two speakers today on Lenin and the national question are Dragan Plavšić, who is he's currently teaching law, and he's co-edited books Balkan Socialist Tradition, The Balkan Tradition 1871 15, and he writes articles for Counterfire. So we're really, really pleased that you could join us today, Dragan. And then after Dragan, we'll hear from Jonathon Shafi. Welcome, Jonathon. Glad you could make it. And Jonathon's based in Scotland and is a socialist activist. So welcome to both of you. And I think, Dragan, you're going to get us started today, aren't you?
Yeah, if you want. I think I'll give it a go first. Right, okay. I'd like to start, I think, with one of the pithiest things that Lenin probably ever said about Marxism, which is probably why I like it so much. Marxism, he once said, consists of determining what policy should be adopted in different types of circumstances. And I think this sentence does a pretty good job of capturing the essential spirit of Lenin's thinking, in particular, the spirit of his thinking on the national question, because it captures very much the characteristic focus of his Marxism, which is all about applying Marxist theory to situations in order to work out what we need to do to advance the cause of socialism, the cause of working class self-emancipation. It's with that spirit in mind that I'm going to try to, not quite shoehorn, I hope, but outline what Lenin had to say about the national question by looking at the three key steps that make up the logical backbone of his thinking on it. I'll end then, after doing that, by saying a word or two about how I think this might apply to Ukraine today. The key starting point here, the first step in Lenin's logic, if you like, is that he saw the national question first and foremost as a fundamentally democratic one, given that it's transparently undemocratic for any nation to rule another nation against its will. And this is why, in his writings, Lenin repeatedly pointed to what he called the general democratic content of all national struggles for freedom from foreign rule. In a sense, I suppose, you could say he saw this content, this democratic content, as the progressive heart of the national question, which socialists had to address appropriately in some shape or form. But following on from this essential point about democracy, I think Lenin was also making another very important point, because on the one hand, he was saying it's precisely because socialists are the most consistent fighters for democracy that we can't afford to ignore the national question, because, according to some socialists, it wasn't really a class question, so workers didn't really have to bother with it. For Lenin, this was foolhardy. It was foolhardy to ignore a question which clearly had the potential to engage millions in political struggle. On the other hand, however, Lenin was also warning against the opposite error of confusing socialism with nationalism, or collapsing socialism into it by ignoring or sidelining the question of class itself. That's why he never tired of pointing out that movements for independence are cross-class nationalist ones, but movements for socialism, by contrast, are working-class internationalist ones. So in other words, by pinpointing the democratic character of the national question, Lenin was trying to steer a path between the mistakes of, on the one hand, ignoring the national question, and on the other, confusing socialism with it. Now, important though all this is, it's still very general and abstract, I admit, and therefore not at all clear how best to avoid these two mistakes. It's with the second step in his logic, therefore, that Lenin, I think, tried to make things rather more specific and concrete by giving the general democratic content he saw in the progressive heart of the national question a clear political formulation. And he did so by making the so-called right of nations to self-determination the cornerstone of the Bolshevik program on the national question. And what he meant by this was something specific. Supporting the right of a nation to self-determination meant supporting its right to secede from a given state if it wanted to. And he argued that recognizing this right meant three specific things for socialists. First, we have to be, as he put it, unconditionally hostile to the use of force in any form by the dominant nation against a nation seeking to secede. Second, he said, we have to demand that the question of secession be settled by means of a democratic vote of the population of the given territory, in other words, by referendum. And third, he said, we have to conduct what he called an implacable struggle against the nationalists of the dominant nation when they deny the right of nations to self-determination. Now, Lenin was, of course, Russian and therefore a member of the dominant nation of the Tsarist Empire, the oppressor of many nations at the time. For him, supporting the right of nations to secede from Tsarist Russia and opposing Russian nationalists who denied this right was therefore, for him, the special and specific duty of Russian socialists, just as it's the special and specific duty of all socialists from dominant nations everywhere. For example, for English socialists vis-a-vis Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, or to take another example, for Spanish socialists vis-a-vis Catalonia or the Basques. And I suppose you can begin now to see where this is taking us, because what on the face of it, taken in isolation, appears to be a straightforwardly nationalist demand that nations be allowed to secede and set up their own separate nation states, becomes, in the context of opposing your own dominant nation, an anti-nationalist or internationalist demand. This is why Lenin often made the point that socialists of a dominant nation like Russia or England or Spain, who refused to support the right to self-determination to the point of secession, were in practice compromising with their own nationalists and ultimately aiding and abetting the state power of their own ruling class. At the same time, however, Lenin also pointed to the real danger of socialists in the seceding nation, transferring their hatred for example, Russian socialists, Russian nationalists to Russian workers, or their hatred for English nationalists to English workers, or their hatred for Spanish nationalists to Spanish workers. Instead, he argued that their special and specific duty was to highlight the common social interests and the common social struggles of the working class of both nations, the seceding one and the dominant one. And it's here, I think, that we can begin to see how the national question is, in fact, what Trotsky once called one of the most labyrinthine and complex, but at the same time, extremely important forms of the class struggle. Because if a ruling class, for example, manages to defeat a national movement seeking secession, its state power will clearly be strengthened. As a result, it'll be better placed to beat back other nations seeking secession, yes, but also crucially better placed to beat back striking workers or anti-war demonstrators, all in the name of the national interest. By contrast, if a national movement succeeds in seceding, the state power of the defeated ruling class will be weakened, which could, if the circumstances are right, provoke a political crisis for it, during which workers and demonstrators might be able to make headway with their own demands. Now, this leads me to the third and the final step of Lenin's logic. In a sense, it's the most specific and concrete step of all, because it's here he makes the critical point that every struggle for national self-determination has to be carefully assessed by socialists to determine whether the concrete political role the national struggle plays in the wider context of the class struggle as a whole is a progressive one or not. And this is vitally important, because although it's true that Lenin was, as I've shown, a supporter of the right of nations to self-determination in most cases. After all, that's why it was in the political program of the Bolsheviks. It's also true he was not a supporter of that right in every case. And he drew here an absolutely critical but often neglected distinction between the right to self-determination on the one hand and its exercise on the other. And he pointed out that supporting a right doesn't necessarily mean supporting its exercise if the circumstances make its exercise politically inadvisable. And he drew a parallel, and very fond of drawing a parallel with divorce of all things to illustrate his point. And he said, just because you've got the right to divorce, he said, doesn't mean you should exercise that right and get divorced. Clearly, whether you exercise it will depend on the circumstances. Likewise, just because, for example, I support your right unconditionally to vote at general elections doesn't mean I'm obliged to support the way you want to exercise it. For example, by voting Tory or Lib Dem for that matter. This distinction, therefore, between the right and its exercise is really important because Lenin was well aware that the right of national self-determination could, in certain circumstances, be exploited by imperial powers with very different goals. And here he drew on the fact that Marx and Engels themselves had opposed the struggles of the oppressed Slav nations of the Ottoman and Habsburg empires of the 19th century, because these struggles had been repeatedly exploited by what was then the most powerful reactionary state of their day, Tsarist Russia, which used their struggles to advance its expansionist goals in Europe. So yes, Lenin would have said, nations have the right to self-determination, but we can legitimately oppose the exercise of this right as socialists if we conclude that the exercise won't be politically progressive in these specific circumstances that it is to be exercised. And I suppose the very, very general point that Lenin was making here was therefore this: we support the right of national self-determination, but it always remains subordinate to what is a far superior form of self-determination, and that's the cause of proletarian or working class self-determination. In other words, socialism. Okay, so those are the three, I think, the three fundamental logical points that form the essence of Lenin's thinking on the national question. Finally, I just want to go on to say a word or two about how all this might potentially apply to Ukraine, because there's been some debate about this over the last few months. Some of it, I have to say, I find rather confusing and indeed misleading, which I think can be clarified to a degree by using Lenin's thought about all this. So what do I think? Well, to begin with, Ukraine has clearly the right to self-determination. There's no question of that. And it's on this fundamental basis that we, of course, oppose fundamentally Russia's imperialist invasion of it. In other words, we oppose that on the very same basis that we oppose NATO's bombing of Serbia in 1999. We oppose the US-UK invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq in 2001, 2003, and all the subsequent interventions in Libya and Syria. But there are some who've attacked us, who've criticized us, because we also say that we oppose Ukraine joining NATO. And they say that by us opposing Ukraine joining NATO, we're somehow denying it its right to self-determination. But of course, it doesn't mean that at all. So let's be clear about what it does mean and what this position really does say. To begin with, as part of its right to self-determination, yes, Ukraine does have the right to apply for membership of international organizations, even international organizations like NATO. And it has the right to join them if their application is then approved. That's not the issue here. That's not the argument. The real issue, which is where the political argument can legitimately take place, is whether Ukraine should exercise its right to self-determination and apply to join NATO. And here, it's precisely at this point that we oppose the exercise of that right. Why? Because NATO is an imperialist organization, led by the United States, that's using and exploiting Ukraine to weaken Russia, as a result helping to create the geopolitical crisis that has led to war and the appalling death and destruction in Ukraine. And that's why we say the best exercise of Ukraine's right to self-determination, a right currently, let's be clear, being crushed to smithereens as NATO and Russia compete over it, is for Ukraine to be neutral between these two imperialist powers.
Dragan, could you begin to draw your remarks to a conclusion?
Yes, certainly. I'm about to finish.
Thank you.
Finally, then, there's just one other right of national self-determination here, which we need to be clear about, and in which we, in fact, need to support as a right. But it's one Western Democrats have been silent about, even though there's been a war over it since 2014. This is the right of the Russians of East Ukraine and Crimea to secede because they don't want to be part of a Ukraine that is in NATO or allied to it. Yes, Russia's exploited this by force for its own geopolitical ends, and we of course oppose that. But we say this question should have been decided and should be decided by a properly democratic referendum. Tragically, therefore, the fact that it wasn't reflects the weaknesses, let's be honest about this, of the left in both Ukraine and Russia. Had they been stronger, they could have argued for resolving these issues, not by more death and destruction, but by more democracy. Thanks, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dragan. Thank you very much indeed. That was really helpful, sort of walking us through those steps at the beginning in order to, more fully understand what's happening at the moment. So, Jonathon, over to you to add your comments to the discussion, and then I will bring people in to join in. So, Jonathon.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll try to keep this quite brief so that we can open the discussion. I know there's other people here in the meeting who'll have lots to say about my kind of element of the talk, which is about how we might apply the kind of framework which Dragan's very well kind of outlined for us there in terms of the Scottish national question and what that means in the context of Britain and the UK. Because if you think about the kind of framework, as I say, that's been outlined, there's a whole number of things which we have to think about now in terms of how a kind of Leninist approach to the Scottish national question might be expressed today. But to do that, we have to kind of look back a little bit at the development of the national question in Scotland and try to identify its key kind of traits, its key kind of features, because they tell us quite a lot about the kind of way in which we might think about the question, but also how we might intervene. So I suppose the first thing to say is that in Scotland, the idea of an independence movement is relatively modern, certainly in its mass form. It's a modern development. The SNP itself was largely a fringe organisation up until just a few decades ago. The national question and the uptake of the national question of independence among the Scottish working class was negligible, in that the Scottish working class were still very, very tightly tied to the Labour Party and the institutions around the Labour Party. And it's also important to say that we certainly wouldn't say that the Scottish independence movement or the Scottish national question refer to or reflect some kind of national liberation struggle. That we understand that the roots of the empire, the British Empire, are intertwined with the development of Scottish capitalism and so on and so on. So that's important. On the other hand, I think it's also important to point out that as the referendum came into being in 2012 and the referendum took place itself in 2014, two, I think, quite important things happened. The first is that support for independence started to rise as a result of the question being posed, but it started to rise not on the basis of national identity necessarily, but it was actually as a result of class questions, which were very high on the agenda. This was seen in that sense as being an opportunity, as an opening through which to express discontent and resistance to the Tories, to austerity, to things like Trident, to the foreign policy of New Labour, and so on and so on. So that was important, and I think quite an organic development. And what was important, I think, about the fact that it was an organic development was that the SNP, while it was nominally leading that campaign, I don't think dominated it, nor did the official structures of the Yes Scotland campaign either. This took on a working class life of its own. And I think the second element that was important was that the radical left did manage to get its act together, did manage to pose some kind of alternative leadership to that of the SNP. And we only were able to do that because we understood, A, the right to self-determination and the democratic process that involves, again, in the way that Dragan talked about. That B, we couldn't afford to ignore it because this was the mass political discussion and phenomenon taking place in the country. So we couldn't afford to ignore it. But at the same time, nor could we simply collapse behind the official leadership and behind the official policy of the campaign. We needed to have something distinctive to say, and we needed, in some sense, to bring class questions into the arena. So that was all very important. Now, I'll lay that kind of down as a kind of framework for then thinking about the national question today, where I think there's some changes. I think there's a lot of debate in Scotland on the left as well about how we approach the situation. One of the things that was mentioned in the previous speech was about how self-determination is exercised. Now, often we look at that from the point of view of, does the left, does the revolutionary left in particular, while having as a principle support of self-determination, always support the idea that self-determination should at any point be exercised. But we might also apply it to the SNP, that kind of thinking to the SNP, because in many ways they have exercised the idea of self-determination, the idea of national independence, in a way to reinforce its own political power in the present moment. There's a phrase which has been developed by the Catalan left, which is known as neo-autonomism. And this is the idea that there's that kind of permanent framing of a kind of national constitutional standoff based on questions of self-determination, which gives elites within the country a very powerful base from which to build from. But at the same time, that self-determination, that independence is never actually meant to be realized. In other words, the elites, that parts of the governing class, parts of the ruling class can utilize the question of self-determination in a way that does, I think, two very important things. One is that it hones around their own political organization large parts of the working class who have pinned their hopes, pinned their strategic outlook on how you get change in society around the question of self-determination and independence. So they shore that base of society up. But on the other hand, and this is what the SNP have been doing, is that they have also used this process as a means to advance capitalist interests within the country, to advance neoliberal ideology, to advance the role of the corporate sector, to undermine in the process class politics as expressed through trade unionism. Now, of course, nominally they support trade unions and so on and so forth, but in practice, as we saw with the bin workers in Glasgow, they also employed anti-trade union laws to oppose that strike. And so in a moment like we have today, where there are the potential for class questions to re-emerge in a much more direct way, in a much more overt way, the premium for socialists in Scotland will be how to reimpose class as the primary division within society, at the same time as understanding the role that independence and that self-determination within that plays. That, again, can't be ignored, nor can it be collapsed into. It has to be connected in some sense to the idea of class struggle. And here, just one point which I think is also contemporary, but also important. and that's about Brexit. Because one of the things that Dragan said, and I think this was really important, was about how movements for national independence can, in some sense, start to take on a reactionary form if they pose the working class of the state that they're trying to secede from as being inherently reactionary, as being inherently unable to conduct any kind of democratic or class politics, and therefore division emerges between the working class. And I think we've seen that in some senses through the question of Brexit, because what you get in Scotland now, among the mainstream elements of Scottish nationalism, among the SNP, and among the kind of satellite organisations within that orbit, is the idea that England is a kind of inherently reactionary place. Not just the state, not just the organs of the state, like the Labour Party, the Tory Party, but the working class of England itself, that the people of England have taken on this post-imperial illusion about their place in the world, and that they are hopelessly attached to that element in the state, to that element in the ideology of the state. And I think that is not only crude, I think it's wrong, but I also think it's politically reactionary, because what does it mean for the project of Scottish independence if at the same time it's not got something to say, it's not got some kind of relationship, progressive relationship, socialist relationship with things like the RMT strike, for example, with things that will emerge in England and across the UK on the question of class. So we have a lot to think about in terms of how we approach this. And I suppose I'll just conclude by saying this, is that because of the conditions of the war in Europe, the economic crisis, the fact that Scotland is not any more a member of the European Union, and it would be quite difficult for Scotland to rejoin the EU unless it adopts its own currency, which means a hard border with England, for example. I think that more and more we're going into a situation where we have this sense that the SNP have independence as a very powerful political frame. A democratic standoff with the Tories in Westminster is an extremely powerful political dynamic in Scotland. And so therefore, I think the task of socialists in Scotland is to support the right to self-determination, absolutely, is to, at the same time, expose the way in which ruling elites and the SNP and the establishment around the SNP utilise the question of self-determination in terms of their own interests, in fact, their own class interests, and that we have to ensure that movements which develop in Scotland don't just take on an anti-Tory, anti-Westminster sentiment, but also take on the characteristic which says we are going to also challenge the ruling class, the SNP, and the Scottish establishment. That it must take on that kind of character as well. Otherwise, you reinforce a frame which allows for Scottish capitalism, for Scottish neoliberalism to continue untrammeled, unopposed. At the same time, because you're reinforcing that frame, you don't actually realise self-determination either. And that's the worst of both worlds. So we have to have class politics back on the agenda. We did, in a very concrete way, organise a demonstration, for example, in Glasgow around the RMT strikes. That brought people from different parts of the Scottish national question together. But at the same time as doing that, we're going to be making an argument which says that the fight against the British state, the fight for Scottish self-determination, is a democratic one which cannot be ignored. And the way that we can successfully navigate that, successfully fail to ignore that, is by reimposing class politics as a premium throughout all these kinds of debates.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. That was really helpful. We're covering a very broad spectrum of the practical arguments about Ukraine, about Scotland, about Brexit.